Hi, welcome to the ProVision Users and Permissions Overview. To manage users and permissions, you need administrative access to ProVision. You can access the Admin section of ProVision by clicking on the gear icon at the top right of the screen, and then select Admin. This brings up the Admin Preferences page, but you also see the other administrative tabs. Look for the Users tab and click on it. This takes you to the screen where you can manage groups, users, and permissions. Quickly looking through the page, it's divided into areas where you can create and manage groups, an area for creating users that you can assign to groups, and a query where you can check permissions for a particular user to show you what kind of access they have to the application. Let's start with groups. By default, up at the top, we start with global admins and read-only groups that are created. Generally, initial users are put into the global admins group. These are people who have administrative access to the entire platform. If you want to relegate access to certain resources, you can simply create a new group to reflect that. Click on the Add Group button, and we see the group information box pop up. Say I want to create a group and have that group only have access to the resource Some Customer with IPAM permissions only. Enter the group name, make sure it's enabled to make it an active group, and then select the resource you want permissions to limit to. The top-level global resource applies globally to the entire platform. So we'd select that if we wanted the group to have IPAM permissions to all resources. Since we said we wanted Some Customer only, I'm going to select Some Customer from the resource dropdown, and then click on the IPAM box for permissions. If I want to add more group permissions, I can add another resource to the list by clicking Add More Group Permissions, and then select another resource. But say I want this group to only be able to read the information for this resource, but nothing else. We can fine-tune the permissions by clicking on the Show Details link, which expands the view and gives more detailed permissions. These permissions are all standard CRUD operations, standing for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. Since we wanted to allow only read permissions for this resource, I'll check the boxes under R. The SWIP box at the end is for enabling and disabling the SWIP function. So if you want the user to be able to update WHOIS data or update RPSL information for RIPE region users, this box would need to be checked. The admin box is if you want them to be an administrator of the application as a whole. The red icon at the end is to delete that resource from the list. Once you're done with setting up the permissions, click the Save button to finish creating the group. It will show a banner at the top of the page letting you know that it finished successfully. So now that we have a group set up, we need to create and assign a user to that group. To make a new user, go to the Add User button in the center of the page and click Add User. You'll see a pop-up where you can fill in the username, first name, last name, decide whether or not to enable help bubbles, and then you can select the group to add that user to. So we will select the group that we just made and then hit Save. We can see the user in the list here. At the end of the row for that user, we see a few actions that we can use to manage it. The lock icon resets passwords. If I click on it, I can assign a new password, and by checking the Send Email box, expand the view to get an option to send an email notification with our credentials. Or I can directly save the changes here. Clicking on the Action menu, the wrench icon, lets us edit that user's information or group, just like when we created them. So you could use this if you needed to change a user to a different group permission set. The last icon in the row is the delete icon. Clicking on it will prompt an "Are you sure?" message, asking if you really want to delete that user, but we don't want to delete it right now, so we'll cancel out. So now that we have our user set up and assigned to a group, if we go back up to the top to that group, we can click on the Action menu, the wrench icon, and see the user listed in that group, showing that its permissions are applied to that user. So now that user can only access the areas according to the permissions that we set up. Finally, down at the bottom of the User tab, we have a Check User Permissions box. If I go to the User dropdown and select the user we just created, we can check to see what permissions that user has. If we look under Resources at TLR and query that, since we did not include TLR permissions for this user, the query should come up as no permissions. However, if we select the resource Some Customer and hit Query, we will see the checkboxes specific to the permissions level that we just set up, and everything looks as we would expect. That concludes our walkthrough of the User and Permissions area. To exit out of the Admin section, go up to the top of the page and click on the Exit Admin tab, and you'll be redirected back to the dashboard.